So I thought what I'd do today, I think this is going to require more than one visit because it's such a big subject and I'm likely to forget some stuff. Remembering that I don't know if you can see that Kestrel there, maybe not. Fantastic. There it goes. Can you see it? Wow. Yeah, I'm probably going to have to do more than one visit on this particular subject because it's so big and it's an area that it's a while since I sort of studied it in depth. But it's psychometrics. So I want to talk about psychometrics today. What are psychometrics? So if you've ever been for a job and you had to fill out a sort of questionnaire thing, and it asks you questions about you, what you prefer, what you like most, or what you think you're like most or least, or questions like that, then you will have been sitting a psychometric profile. And psychometric profiles are quite a popular way for potential employers to screen potential employees, because personality is quite important when it comes to getting the right fit. Oh yeah. So there's lots of reasons why you might want to get the right person. So imagine you're going for a job where you're customer service, they want to know that you're friendly, you're going to remain calm, you can probably also take a bit of abuse and so they're looking for somebody with those personality traits. So that's really what profiles do. They look at finding out something about your personality through answering a few questions. And they do that in the claim, I suppose, is that it's objective, because it's not down to the interviewer kind of making judgments about the person, which you might get wrong. And the person doing the interview, the interviewee, might also try to mislead you. But the idea is with these tests, they're difficult to fool. Okay, so that's the idea, and using them you can find the right person for the job, the good fit. So that's the idea behind them. So they've got quite a history, and some of it's not all great really. So if you go back to the beginnings, that famous guy called Francis Galton was kind of at the heart of the development of psychometrics. So you may or may not know, but he was quite a famous eugenicist, so not a great guy. And but he was trying to, certainly with psychometrics, he was trying to use a scientific and quantitative approach to understanding different personality types or traits. Probably with a view to trying to discourage certain people from having children. So again, not a great guy. But anyway, that's the beginning. Clearly that's not the idea now, but it actually predates him anyway. So if you go back to the Greeks had the 4 humours. And this was another way, an early way of sort of categorising people. They didn't do it through statistical factor analysis, they did it, actually I don't know how they did it, I think they just did it by judging people. But there's no scientific basis in it. But we even have some of the words from that time. So if you're phlegmatic, for instance, that comes from one of those humours. Anyway, so if we fast forward now to more modern day approaches to psychometrics, what are they doing? Well, they're basically trying to categorise people into meaningful groups. Now, in reality, however many people there are on the planet, approaching 8 billion I guess at the moment, that's how many different people you've got, personality types, because everybody is different. However, that kind of doesn't help you, doesn't tell you anything. So psychometrics basically tries to reduce that down to something a bit more manageable and useful. So it's looking for correlations, really. Correlations between one thing and another thing that allows you then to group people into certain personality traits. The main 5 personality traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So they're the big 5. And the way that the big 5 works is that it's basically saying that everybody exists on a dimension for each one of those factors. So for instance, everybody can be placed on a conscientious line. So maybe you're very conscientious, maybe you're a bit conscientious, maybe you're not very conscientious at all. And so you can imagine that you can be anywhere along that dimension, even where you're not conscientious at all. Same goes for extroversion or agreeableness and so on. So everybody kind of has a place on that line where they tend to operate. And you can imagine once you've got all 5, you've got a kind of picture of your personality profile. And then you might be looking for particular profiles if you're looking for a particular job. So that's the idea. Now the big 5 is a normative approach. So a normative approach just basically means that in order to do your profile, thousands of other people's profiles have already been done, and your scores are kind of measured against those norms. So you can imagine there'll be a kind of average amount of agreeableness across all those thousands of people that have done the test, and essentially you're measured against that. And if you score higher on agreeableness than the norm, then you will be said to be high in that particular characteristic. And everybody will be higher or lower than the norm for some of these characteristics, really. I don't think it's possible to have a kind of completely average profile. Somebody might correct me on that. So that's a normative model. But there's also something called an ipsative model. And ipsative models have become really popular in the workplace. So a lot of the really well known, and I've decided not to mention names of any of these products because I don't want to get into any arguments about the merits of any specifics or lack thereof. But a lot of the really common ones are ipsative. So rather than looking at a norm or thousands of other participants and measuring you sort of against that, ipsative profiles only look at your own categories and your own traits and tendencies. So all they can really say is that, let's say you choose those same 5, although they're generally slightly different, but just for the purposes. So in a normative test, agreeableness will be measured against other people, whereas an ipsative test, your agreeableness will be measured against your other qualities. So you might be more agreeable than you are conscientious, or you might be more conscientious than you are neurotic. And so you get the idea. So it's not really telling you much about this person in comparison to the rest of the population. It's just telling you this person's dominant characteristics compared to other characteristics that they might have. So for that reason, and I don't want to get into trouble here, but for that reason I think most organisational psychologists and occupational psychologists, researchers will probably say that, especially for recruitment purposes, you're probably better off doing or using a normative test. Because if your goal is to try and, screen somebody, then you really want to know how they perform compared to other people. So that's the difference between ipsative and normative. Now you can tell an ipsative test because they normally ask you questions like, they might give you 4 options and ask you to say which one of those 4 you think you're most like and which one of those 4 you think you're least like. And it's often quite hard because you might not think you like any of them, or you might think you are like all of them. Oh dear. So you can tell if it's an ipsative test because it's called a forced choice. You have 4 options and you have to pick 2, no matter whether you think they kind of reflect you or not. They're the 2 differences. Now, of course, if you're going for a job and you recognise your profile tool, or the one that the company's using, is an ipsative one, my advice would be not to tell them that they should be using a normative test, because you're kind of unlikely to get the job, I would suggest, unless they like somebody who's got attitude. Right, what else can I say about psychometrics? Yeah, so there's a whole question mark by some around just how useful they are and just what they're telling you. Some psychologists vociferously are dead against them because they are measuring constructs like conscientiousness, agreeableness and so on, that are kind of, well, certainly socially constructed and, according to the critics, are kind of meaningless. The proponents of them would say they're not meaningless because they have been identified through thousands and thousands of correlations. So maybe I should explain what I mean by correlation. So a correlation is when you see one thing with another. It has a relationship to it. So I used the one about happiness before. So if you were trying to work out, how to measure happiness, you might decide, you might ask lots of questions, and then you might say, well, people who are happy, people who self-report being happy, also self-report being very outgoing. So at this point you're noticing that being very outgoing is correlated with happiness, and then you might find that outgoingness is correlated with a lot of other things as well. So really what you're trying to do is you're trying to find all the things that are related to each other, and ultimately you're trying to find as fewer words as possible to describe as much as possible. Hopefully that makes sense. And that's where factor analysis comes in. And these days it's all done by computer, which makes it a lot easier to identify all of these correlations. Now, perhaps the most controversial, let's say, of all of these is something called G. And G stands for general intelligence. So there's a number of these. The most famous one is the IQ test. And the IQ test is another psychometric test. But this time it's not testing personality traits, it's testing intelligence. And it's believed that there's this thing called general intelligence, or G, that tells you something about lots of different domains. So people who tend to be good with numbers tend to be good with words, logical thinkers. Oh, do I go down there? I think it's that. Is it? Thank you. I'm not sure I'm on the right road here. We'll find out, won't we? Yeah, so G is I suppose controversial because it's pretty tough if you do an IQ test and you're told your quotient, your score is lower than the average. That's kind of tough, and so I suppose one of the things you might then do is deny that it means anything. And to be fair, there are many people who say that it doesn't mean something. But one of the reasons that we think it does is because it does seem to predict for success in a whole range of domains. So people with high IQs tend to do better at work, tend to earn more money, and so on. So that's one of the reasons why IQ is seen as valuable. But stop, say the people who don't agree with it. That's only the case because you've sort of created a system. We'll talk about who you is in a minute, but you've created a system whereby the things that you think are valuable are tested, and it has nothing to do with intelligence per se. It's just that you've created a way of measuring that measures the things that you value. And this is often a criticism of a kind of Western, often male, I suppose, scientific approach, in that things that are valued by that society, Western male dominated societies, no surprise they come up with a test that they seem to do better at. Now, I'm not sure whether that's true or not, and I don't want to get into that argument because I actually don't know. And I'm not even sure how important it is. I think it does matter, but unfortunately the discussion kind of gets hijacked a little bit. But anyway, that's G. Now it's interesting, I've never done an IQ test, and I don't think I want to. I've done my further education and I didn't seem to struggle, but then there's other times when I do things that I really have struggled. And I suppose my worry is that I'll do an IQ test and it'll say I'm below average, and all the achievements I've made, I'll kind of feel out of control. I'll kind of feel a little bit like you know, well, you're still thick. So I'm not going to do one, I don't think. I was bought a kit many years ago and it sat on my shelf. I never did it. Nowadays, of course, you can do it on computer fairly cheaply. But I think I'm happy just kind of being who I am. So yeah. So that's another psychometric. So I've gone through all the things I can think about with psychometrics. How useful are they? Well, I think they can be useful. They're used in recruitment. Don't see a big problem with that. They shouldn't be the only thing that you measure though. Not forgetting that there's always an element of error in these things. None of them are 100% valid or reliable. Validity means measuring the thing you think you're measuring, and reliability meaning you're going to get pretty much the same result every time. So we know that not 100% of those things, so people do get different scores, but they are pretty valid and reliable, if that makes sense. Whew.